Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Utah. The Center for Latin American Studies serves as a hub for Latin American-related activities at the University of Utah involving teaching, research, and community outreach. The center houses an interdisciplinary Latin American Studies program with coursework that provides students with an understanding of both the shared traditions and the astounding cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity of the region. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the criminalization of corruption in Latin America. If you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them into the YouTube chat. And now I will turn the time over to Political Science Assistant Professor Laura Gamboa.
Thank you, Anne. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce today Dr. Ezequiel Gonzalez Ocantos, who is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oxford. Ezequiel has a long trajectory of publications. He's the author of 2 books with Cambridge University Press, Shifting Legal Visions, which won various awards, and The Politics of Transitional Justice in Latin America, which was published last year. He has also published various articles on judicial politics, corruption, and qualitative methods in all sorts of outlets, including the American Journal of Political Science, Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Latin American Research Review, and the Journal of Peace Research, among many others. He is here today to present an excerpt of his book manuscript, The Criminalization of Corruption in Latin America, Causes, Consequences of Lava Jato, which is a study of these massive corruption processes that started a couple of years ago throughout Latin America, and this massive corruption scandal that engulfed several countries across the region. This book is co-authored with Viviana Barebar, Paula Muñoz, and Nara Pavao, and I'm just really looking forward to his presentation today.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, Claudia, as well, for inviting me to present my work today. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about this project and get some feedback and share ideas with all of you. So as Laura mentioned, this is a co-authored project with 4 wonderful colleagues based in Oxford, but also in Peru and Brazil. And the sort of empirical focus of this book is this mega anti-corruption investigation that started in Brazil in 2014 and is known as Lava Jato, the car wash operation. Investigators in Brazil discovered that the executives of the state-owned oil company Petrobras received millions of dollars in bribes to award contracts to other companies at higher than market prices. And then they funneled these resources to their political bosses, who then used that money to fund electoral campaigns. Hundreds of Brazilian politicians and businessmen have been indicted, and some even went to jail. And among other things, the imprisonment of former President Lula da Silva in 2018 completely appended the presidential elections of that year, and in many ways facilitated the victory of Jair Bolsonaro in that presidential election. But what is interesting about Lava Jato is that it is not just limited to Brazil. According to official documentation that was released by American prosecutors in December 2016, one of the companies at the heart of the scandal, a construction company called Odebrecht, paid and bribed politicians all over the world, including Latin America. And these revelations prompted judicial authorities in all of these countries to start their own national chapters of Lava Jato beyond Brazil. And one of those chapters, the Peruvian chapter of Lava Jato, stands out. This investigation started with a narrow focus on a series of public works projects in Peru, but it quickly expanded its remit. And so since 2016, when this started, every single former president elected since the return of democracy in 2000 has been investigated, as well as major opposition figures, regional governors, capital city mayors. And many of them have actually spent some time in jail. Most tragically, you might know, one of these former presidents, Alan Garcia, committed suicide on the day that the police arrived at his home ready to arrest him. And so if you look carefully at the Peruvian chapter of Lava Jato, you will find that this investigation is responsible for the resignation of a president in March 2018, Garcia's suicide in April 2019, the dissolution of Congress in 2019, a very unusual congressional election a few months later, which led to a massive repudiation of the establishment and high levels of fragmentation. And finally, yet another presidential downfall a few months ago. So our interest in this story stems from sort of two general questions, if you want. The first one is, well, what is the best way to fight corruption, especially systemic corruption? So some scholars would tell you that electoral accountability, elections, are a good way to fight corruption, to weed out the bad apples, if you want. But of course, we know that electoral punishment of corrupt politicians is weak and inconsistent across democracies. Another sort of possibility is proposed by those who emphasize the need for systemic shocks, for example, via massive economic crisis or military defeats, big bangs, so to speak, that radically alter the incentives and the norms in a society. But of course, these shocks are extremely rare, and many times they're very costly. And a final sort of alternative is this idea of building institutional strength through reforms that improve horizontal accountability within the state. But unfortunately, these reforms tend to be introduced often in a piecemeal fashion, and they're quite ineffective if corruption is deeply entrenched and systemic. So what about Lava Jato? What kind of anti-corruption measure is this? Well, Lava Jato is an instance of what in this project we call judicial anti-corruption crusades. These are sustained efforts to prosecute and punish corruption through the courts. In many ways, it's the anti-corruption enforcement paradigm on steroids, right? So investigators in these crusades are not just reactive, but are actually very proactive and zealous anti-corruption agents. They operate in small groups that usually resemble sort of cells, combat cells with high levels of internal cohesion and a very, very strong sense of institutional mission. These cells target a wide range of politicians and businessmen, usually in a short period of time, but this need not be the case, leading to spectacular waves of convictions, evidence gatherings, indictments, and so on and so forth. And sometimes these actors promote broader changes to the institutional environment and try to sort of galvanize through public campaigns voters against corrupt elites. And in addition to Lava Jato, other examples you may know about are Manipulite, the Manipulite operation in Italy in the 90s, the work of Nigeria's Economic and Financial Crimes Commission in the 2000s. So as a mechanism to fight corruption, these crusades in many ways have the shock-like qualities that many emphasize are needed to uproot systemic corruption, but they're also firmly anchored in these institutions of horizontal accountability, in this case, the prosecution and the courts. And so with this in mind, in the book, we sort of try to answer two questions. The first one is, well, why do these mega investigations emerge, and why do some of them gain momentum, but others actually stall? And second, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, is, well, how do voters process these unusual shocks to the system? What are the effects of these investigations on people's attitudes towards politics and corruption? So as I said, today I'm going to focus on this second question, but in the book we investigate both, because there is something about the nature of these investigations and why they gain momentum that is important to understand what sorts of effects they might have on public opinion. So let me start very briefly by talking about this first question about the origins and the drivers of these prosecutions. So the conventional wisdom, if you want, I mean, this is true if you ask politicians who are targeted by these investigations, but also some political scientists as well, is that, you know, these investigations are nothing but politics by other means. So at best, judges and prosecutors simply respond to political signals, for example, shifts in the balance of power to know when they can pursue corruption and against which groups. And at worst, these prosecutions are simply political weapons. And this is particularly true, for example, in authoritarian regimes where purges are very common. Now, we think that this is a very sort of simplistic way of thinking about the drivers of these investigations, especially when it comes to these big cases like Lava Jato or Manipulit, because the crusaders that are part of these processes, the prosecutors and the judges, engage in widespread targeting. They're not just narrowly focused on certain groups, and they even target very powerful establishment actors. But more importantly, we think sort of the dynamics of these inquiries are never linear. They sort of defy this idea of top-down planning by somebody with ulterior motives. There's always lots of twists and turns. There's lots of room for contingency and error. So there's something else going on than this idea of top-down planning. And more importantly, we think, even when these investigations go after weak political actors, criminalizing corruption is actually very hard. So it can't just all be, mobilized from above. There are simply too many evidentiary and political obstacles along the way, in part because these crimes are very opaque. They're very hard to prove. For example, proving intent when corruption is systemic is really difficult. And of course, the targets of these investigations, however weak they might be, never just allow, prosecutors to collapse their governments or collapse their businesses. They always lash back. They always fight back. So there's always a lot of obstacles along the way that need to overcome. And so because of this, we think that it's important to pay attention to judicial behavior, not just the politics outside the courtroom, but actually what happens in these investigative units that undertake these cases. And this is important to understand why the crusades emerge, why they gain momentum, and why they maintain that momentum. So one of the arguments we make is that given all of these difficulties, investigators tend to succeed when they are able to use and willing and able to use a series of unorthodox and controversial prosecutorial tools that allow them to trigger these productive flows of evidence and create defensive shields vis-a-vis the targets or the defendants. And so to accomplish this, we argue they need to step outside their comfort zones, and they must become zealous street prosecutors, the ones you often see in the movies. They must make strategic use of plea bargains, of pretrial detentions, and other very aggressive evidence-gathering tools. They must engage in creative interpretations of international and domestic law. They must nurture relations with witnesses, with foreign authorities to secure evidence, with the private sector, with the media, and so on and so forth. Now, this is normally how you think of prosecutors in the United States. In Latin America, however, this kind of behavior, of zealous behavior, is actually quite uncommon, and it implies the abandonment of bureaucratic routines and the embracement of innovation, right? So the idea of the prosecutor hero, which is celebrated in the American legal tradition, in American cinema, is quite foreign to many of these countries. It is also not a proven route to political power, for example, as it is in some cases in the United States. So we argue that prosecutors need to sort of learn and be willing to embrace these rather unusual tools. And to do so, and to succeed, we argue they need to develop the skills, the political and the technical know-how to use these strategies, the willingness to accept risk when using those strategies, to sort of defy and go beyond the terms of reference. And of course, they also need some luck, and contingency plays an important part in our story. So in the first part of the book, we try to develop an argument about where these skills and this willingness, this greater willingness to use these aggressive prosecutorial tools come from. And we tell a story of institutional reforms in Latin America in the 1980s, starting in the 1980s, which enhanced prosecutorial autonomy, that implemented different kinds of criminal justice systems, transitioning to more accusatorial American-style models, and processes that produced sort of the legal translation of international anti-corruption standards and norms. And so in many ways, these reforms provided some minimum levels of political insulation for the prosecution services. They created a better legal framework to deal with white-collar crime, with macro criminality, and allowed some cohorts of prosecutors in some countries to become experts in white-collar crime and develop the organizational capacity to investigate these accusations. And also, the argument looks at more short-term factors or, contingent choices during the course of the investigation, which we think are critical to explain not just why they start, but also why they gain momentum, why these allegations snowball into much bigger affairs. In particular, we show that the extent to which investigators operate as cohesive teams, task forces usually, is critical for success, because this allows them to optimize investigative and defensive strategies, but also because it generates a series of positive feedback mechanisms that enhance their commitment to the cause, to the case, and also it enhances their leverage vis-a-vis powerful defendants. So the interesting thing in many ways about the prosecutorial zeal that is needed to succeed is that it's also often the Achilles heel of these investigations. Not only because zealous prosecutors put the establishment on high alert, and normally the establishment fights back and puts a lot of obstacles along the way, but also because this zeal, this sort of innovation with the law, provides the perfect ammunition for those who are being targeted with the investigations to actually cry foul, to complain, to say, this is an instance of lawfare, this is breaking with clear standards of legality. So in many ways, what might in principle be seen as a noble cause, who doesn't want to fight corruption and eradicate corruption, can actually very quickly become something extremely contested. And this is why understanding the nature of these investigations is important to understand what kind of impact they might have on the public, on public opinion, which is, as I said earlier, the subject matter of the second part of the book and what I'll concentrate in the rest of this talk. We are interested in understanding what kinds of messages do these crusades send to the public and how voters decode those messages. It is, of course, impossible to sort of isolate, if you want, the causal effect of these very messy and protracted affairs. But it's fair to say, I think, that they raise the salience of corruption, and that's why they can be quite disruptive. But the message that this higher salience produces is unclear. Our focus here is not so much on how it affects voters' behavior at the ballot box, but we're interested in how these informational shocks, if you want, affect more general dispositions, emotions, and attitudes at the heart of those accountability choices. We're interested in understanding whether these prosecutions signal to voters the possibility of political regeneration or actually the further political decay. Are voters put off by these investigations, or do they become more politically engaged? Do they become more cynical about politics or more hopeful about the possibility of changing politics for the better? Our point of departure here is that the effect of these investigations is actually a complex interaction between what happens in the courts and how citizens perceive what is going on there. It's a mixture of reality and perception, if you want, and those perceptions are anchored in citizens' pre-existing baseline attitudes, if you want. Even when the courts are above good and evil, even when they're doing something that, as I said, is in principle uncontroversial, like, for example, fighting corruption, citizens can interpret these dramas in rather unusual and unexpected ways. But the interesting thing is that, as I also argued earlier, courts are not always above good and evil when they're fighting corruption. They often have to bend the rules a little bit. So this makes everything much more contested and complicates the equation. So with this in mind, we think there's sort of two stories one can tell about these possible effects. One is a very pessimistic story, which draws from a large literature that shows there's a negative relationship between corruption and trust. And so for these pessimists, by disclosing authoritative evidence of corruption on this massive, massive scale, these crusades simply reinforce political cynicism because they persuade voters to accept that corruption is inherent to politics. It's inevitable. So when the prosecutors reconstruct the puzzle of corruption, if you want, they open up a space for generalizations about the crass nature of politics. So corruption is now constitutive of political activity. It's not the product, if you want, of circumstantial moral failure or individual greed. It's systemic. So a system that it's rotten, at its core is likely to inspire, we think, emotions like anxiety, anger, or shame, which are likely to lead people to conclude that little can be done to change reality, that one should simply withdraw from politics and remain indifferent to corruption. But then we also have the optimists, if you want, who believe that these crusades can actually be interpreted by voters as a sign that the system has the capacity, has the antibodies to disrupt business as usual. They're like a big bang that dramatizes in a very clear way a country's potential to regenerate politically. Here's a picture of Brazil's Judge Sergio Moro in charge of Lava Jato in that country, who in one of his rulings wrote and quoted Teddy Roosevelt, "The exposure and punishment of corruption is an honor to the nation. It's not a disgrace." And so for the optimists, what the pessimists are actually overlooking is the fact that the courts are central to these processes, and that centrality changes the dynamics. And this is because judicial rituals and procedures generate symbolic capital, what some people call the myth of legality. And so these rituals of legalism that the courts use allow them to produce more credible, more definitive, more authoritative narratives of guilt and innocence. And so it is possible that these investigations, because of this myth of legality, can actually trigger feelings of system satisfaction that undermine cynicism about politics. So the message is, well, corruption doesn't have to be inherent to politics. Corruption can be curbed effectively. And in so doing, the optimists suggest, well, you're going to trigger mobilizing emotions like hope and enthusiasm, and people are more likely to engage productively with the system. This is a similar argument to one put forward by the great comparative politics scholar Guillermo O'Donnell back in the 90s, when he argued in his seminal essay on horizontal accountability that the intervention of these horizontal accountability actors can actually prevent anti-corruption discourse from becoming or from exacerbating disaffection and cynicism. Without punishment, without the state doing something about it, anti-corruption rhetoric can decant very quickly into cynicism. Now, we think, as you might expect, these are very simplistic narratives. There's some truth in many ways to both. But whether we end up with more or less cynicism is actually more conditional than either of these two stories suggests. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and walk you through a very sort of blunt version of the argument. And as I do this, I'm going to present some of the findings report in one of the chapters of the book, which relies heavily on both focus group data, but also on some descriptive statistics from surveys we collected in Brazil, conditional impact of Lava Jato, if you want, on public opinion. We need to pay attention to two different dimensions of the public conversation that evolves around this issue. And how the conversation unfolds in these dimensions will lead to more or less cynicism. The first dimension has to do with, well, what does the Lava Jato brand represent in the minds of voters? What is more salient in the minds of the voters? And here the argument is quite simple. If what becomes salient, if the brand becomes associated with the crimes, with what is being revealed about politics, with the problem, if you want, then these are likely to become negative information shocks that exacerbate cynicism. But if the conversation also pays attention to the judicial effort, to the solution, rather than just the problem, then there is some room for activating these mechanisms of system satisfaction that are associated with the optimistic story. And so the public opinion data we collected for this project suggests that this is not merely a theoretical construct, but this is actually a meaningful way of describing how people think about these issues. Let me start with some focus group data from Peru, where we did some focus groups in July 2019. And what we find in these focus groups is that voters here fixate on the crimes, not just on the judicial effort. And the result is a very pessimistic discussion. We began the focus groups by giving voters or the participants a map of emotions and ask them, well, how do you feel about Lava Jato? And the emotions that the participants gave us were overwhelmingly negative: anger, disgust, indignation, shame. And this is also something we find in a representative survey that we did a few months later, where the intensity of negative emotions is much higher than the intensity of positive emotions. Now, going back to the focus groups for a second, what is interesting is that this negative emotional reaction is accompanied by a discussion of Lava Jato that focuses mainly on the crimes, not on the judicial effort. Interestingly, the only person in these focus groups who talked about hope also did so with reference to the prosecutor and the judge. In other words, they did so with reference to the investigation, not just the crimes that were being uncovered. When we look at the vocabulary that people use, and apologies because this is in Spanish, the vocabulary that voters use to talk about Lava Jato, we see words like corruption, the names of the companies, of the corrupt politicians. The names of the prosecutors, for example, do appear, but are very peripheral to the entire conversation. To get a better sense of how participants imagine Lava Jato and conceptualize its ontology, if you want, we ask them to play a personification game. What would Lava Jato, this very abstract thing, look like if he or she walked into this room? And this was fascinating because in all groups, this personification game elicited a very strong consensus. Lava Jato would be a man, married, middle-aged, wealthy, that lives in a posh part of Lima, that has a younger lover, that lies, that is very selfish, that is good to his friends, but not to his enemies. In other words, Lava Jato is a crook. Lava Jato is corruption. It is not the solution to the problem of corruption. Similarly, when we played the animalization game, Lava Jato would be an animal associated with dirt, with treachery, with danger, not a superhero, for example. Now, I'll come back to this, but the story, I just wanted to move now to the story that emerges in Brazil about this sort of first dimension of the public conversation, which is very different. In Peru, we also started with this discussion about emotions. And here, unlike in Peru, we see a mixture of emotions. Of course, many of our Brazilian participants felt despair, pessimism in the face of Lava Jato. Nothing will change because it's impossible to get rid of corruption. But many here were very hopeful. For them, Lava Jato is a game changer. Lava Jato is a moralizing force that comes to change politics. It's an avenger, a superhero, not a rat, right? Or a cockroach. And Lava Jato sends the message that corruption doesn't have to pay off. One of the participants actually very neatly summarized these two ways of thinking about Lava Jato. I have friends who say they don't believe in anything anymore because the number of corruption cases, right? The crimes being revealed. But there is another side to it. Now there is accountability. Now there is hope. Now, the discussion of emotions in Brazil, interestingly, is highly linked to discussions about the effects of Lava Jato on individuals. And here too, we see a divide between those who emphasize the crimes and describe a personal process of depoliticization. There's no options, right? I'm disappointed in traditional parties. Politics is a circus. Politics is a joke. Corruption seems to be inherent to politics. And those who, by focusing on the investigation, are able to see a possible process of personal politicization, of greater engagement. Lava Jato is eye-opening. It has high informational value. People can become more vigilant as a result. And citizens feel they can now, and they should, imitate the courts and be themselves these avengers. Now, I'm happy to discuss later on why we think the focus in Brazil is mixed, whereas the focus in Peru is mainly on the crimes. But there's some things that we've studied, and I'm happy to show you the evidence for this, that the baseline levels of cynicism are very different in both countries. In Peru, they're very, very high, which means that it's very hard for voters to get past that, even in the face of something that could actually bring some solutions to the problems of corruption. Second, Brazilians, unlike Peruvians, had more experience with effective anti-corruption efforts through the courts prior to Lava Jato, which means that perhaps they found it easier to believe, right, than the Peruvians. And finally, the media environment is very different. So we did content and sentiment analysis of all the headlines associated with this case in 4 major national newspapers, and we find that media coverage is much more negative and crime-focused in Peru than it is in Brazil. But having said that, let me now turn to the second dimension of the public conversation, which can also allow us to understand better why we see this sharp contrast between Brazil and Peru. And this second dimension has to do with how voters evaluate the judicial effort. We argue here that when voters pay attention to the work of the courts, if they pay attention to the work of the courts, perceptions of judicial fairness and effectiveness in the conduct of these investigations will determine whether that room for optimism actually produces optimism or decants into additional cynicism. Why is this the case? Well, because voters need to buy into this myth of legality. This is not something that is automatically projected. On the one hand, perceptions of fairness matter because they condition the credibility of the judicial effort. And obviously, perceptions of effectiveness matter as well because they condition levels of disillusionment. And constructing this myth of legality is not easy. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the prosecutorial tactics at the heart of these investigations are highly controversial, and therefore they could undermine the idea that people are being treated fairly. But more importantly, baseline attitudes, in particular partisan preferences, will affect and color evaluations of fairness and impartiality. This means, in other words, that pessimistic expectations, a pessimistic story, can materialize both if the public just fixates on the crimes, but also if, when it looks at the judicial effort, it perceives court failures rather than fairness and effectiveness. One very interesting thing about the focus groups in Brazil is that we found that Brazilians loved to talk about the judicial process much more than the Peruvians. They debated fairness and effectiveness at length, right? Peruvians were much more reluctant. And this, we think, has a lot to do with the different political and partisan contexts in which both sets of voters are immersed. So in many ways, heated discussions about fairness and judicial fairness and effectiveness in Brazil were partly driven by political polarization between the supporters of the Workers' Party, arguably the party that's been most affected by the investigation, and those who oppose the Workers' Party. And this suggests perhaps that the salience of the judicial effort vis-a-vis the crimes is partly driven by these partisan feuds. So in other words, partisanship colors how you see the investigation, but it also leads voters to pay more attention to the investigation and the work of the courts. Let's start with Brazil this time. So a survey that was conducted in 2018, for example, shows that the public is very, very divided when it comes to views of the fairness and the impartiality of Lava Jato. But what's interesting here is that supporters of the Workers' Party, of the PT, feel particularly victimized by this investigation. They're being unfairly treated. Now, we see a very similar partisan divide in our focus groups. Obviously, for many voters, non-Workers' Party supporters, the fact that former President Lula in the picture here went to jail is a sign that everybody's equal, but in the eyes of the law. This is a good thing. This means that the investigation is impartial. Now, many of our participants would voice these claims. However, at this stage of the conversation, this is why focus groups are interesting, because they allow you to see the dialogic process of opinion formation. The supporters of the Workers' Party would step in and they would challenge this rosy assessment. For them, Lava Jato actually disproportionately targets the left. They were very furious at the time of the focus groups with the situation of a right-wing senator, Aécio Neves, who had managed to escape the tentacles of Lava Jato. For them, there's clearly special interests behind Lava Jato. It's not impartial. And again, the other camp, the pro-Lava Jato camp, if you want, would step in at this stage once again to counter some of these criticisms. They would try, very interestingly, to rationalize this impartiality that it's in many ways quite apparent. Lava Jato, they would argue, might have originally targeted the left, but that's changing. Wait and see. It's too early to tell. And the fact that people like the right-wing senator managed to escape the tentacles of justice has nothing to do with the prosecutors. It has to do with the fact that some politicians are more skillful at evading justice than others. And of course, the PT was in power for many, many years during the 2000s. So of course, it had more opportunities to steal. Of course, it's going to be the target of the investigation, disproportionately speaking. It is worth sort of noting, I think, that the discussions in the focus groups about the investigations in Brazil were not all about partisan quibbles, right? So there were some non-partisan objections as well. So in particular, when we ask the participants to talk in some depth about some specific prosecutorial strategies, many non-partisans in the room, non-PT supporters, would also object to some of these tactics. So for example, they would think that plea bargains, which again are a very new thing in Brazil and in Latin America, are unfair. They were skeptical about the real motives behind the concessions that the prosecutors were making. They thought the information was not reliable. Similarly, they thought that the excessive use of pretrial detentions during the inquiry was actually setting up a circus rather than a genuine effort to know the truth. So in many ways, the nature of judicial behavior, not just partisan interpretations of that behavior, introduce important tensions that make it harder for the criminalization of grand corruption to actually trigger this system satisfaction that is so important in the optimistic narrative. Now, if in Brazil we find this sort of big debate and lively debate about process, about the judicial process and its merits, with opinions sort of sharply divided along partisan lines, Peruvians, as I said earlier, do not talk as much about the investigation. The unprompted narrative that I discussed at the beginning is one that's very gloomy, that's one of deep worry, of disgust, and they focus, as we saw, on the crimes. Now, we think that this lack of attention to the judicial process could be due to the absence of the kinds of partisan attachments and exchanges between voters that we see in Brazil. Parties in Peru are extremely weak. It's a democracy without parties. Peruvians are not partisans. In many ways, they're anti-partisan. They hate politicians. They hate parties to an extent that it's not seen in a lot of places in Latin America, for sure. This means that, for example, they're not likely to feel particularly victimized by any effort to prosecute a particular politician. And therefore, they're less likely to sort of try and defend or accuse the investigation from a partisan perspective. And so you don't see the kinds of partisan clashes you see in Brazil about the fairness of the investigation, and therefore people talk less about the investigation. But of course, we wanted to know what they thought about it, so we poked them and we prompted them to talk. What we see here in the Peruvian case is that, although in principle, and this is something we see in the survey, Peruvians approve of the job that the Lava Jato task force was doing at the time, they were positive about it. When we asked them to reflect upon this in the focus groups, skepticism and cynicism, if you want, surfaced very quickly. So this is true, for example, when discussing some prosecutorial tactics, like, for example, plea bargains, again, a very new tactic in Peru. Participants almost unanimously expressed doubts about these tactics. They're ineffective, they're unjust, they're incompatible with prosecutors' duties. Prosecutors should be going after the corrupt, not negotiating with the corrupt. And this is highly problematic because the investigation in Peru, and we can talk about this later, is heavily reliant on an agreement with the company, with Odebrecht, that provides the information the prosecutors use to go after the politicians. So voters should in principle like these deals because they allow the prosecutors to punish the corrupt, but actually they don't. In another chapter of the book, we use a conjoint experiment to look at, in more detail at the willingness of voters to make these trade-offs, and we find that they're not willing to make them at all, and this complicates the public reputation of the investigation. Now, we also see in the case of Peru a very, very high level of pessimism about the future of corruption post Lava Jato, right? In a survey, again, most voters thought that corruption would either increase or stay the same in the future. And in the focus groups, we see these as well. We're running out of politicians, said one of the voters. There's no options. What are we going to do? What's the point of democracy anymore? Politicians will just get better at corruption. They're going to steal more in the future. The political class will be recycled. It's all a sham. So in many ways, the way Peruvians talk about Lava Jato reflects this deep, deep cynicism about politics and political institutions. The investigation has reinforced rather than curbed these feelings of despair. Very few see a way out of this mess. They're so cynical that in the focus groups, they even joked that they did not think former President Garcia had actually killed himself. They thought, oh, he must be enjoying some cozy retirement in the Caribbean. That is the level of cynicism. By contrast, the prognosis that Brazilians make in surveys and in the focus groups, yeah, I'll be done in 2 seconds. In both focus groups and the survey is actually a bit more positive. At least the public is divided rather than unanimously of the opinion that things are not going to work out. So we see this in the survey. We also see this in the focus groups. Some people, of course, think it's not going to work. Again, that the corrupt politicians are going to survive, but others are actually, unlike in Peru, there's a significant chunk of the electorate that thinks that the investigation has already achieved a lot and that it can do even better. In fact, they argued for the institutionalization of Lava Jato. So let me just finish with a few final thoughts. The first one is that when we started this project, we thought we had very strong optimistic priors. We thought, hang on, I'm getting a few messages here. Oh, sorry, there were questions. Fine. So I'm going to finish in just 1 second. So as I was saying, the priors we had at the beginning of the project were rather optimistic. We thought that voters, would sort of process these things in more positive ways. But we quickly came to realize as we looked at the data and talked to voters and saw survey data that actually we were wrong, that these investigations are way more problematic than they might seem at first hand. First of all, these crusades are almost always painting a picture of corruption that is more serious than whatever voters may have imagined beforehand. And this has a potential to alienate voters from politics. So when you apply this kind of prosecutorial zeal in Brazil and Peru, you find a cesspool, right? It's different from doing this, I don't know, in Denmark or Sweden, where you can, select the bad apples and get rid of them. Here, it seems that everything is problematic, everything is rotten. So these prosecutorial efforts can ravage political systems, can ravage political trust in these systems, and voters end up perceiving they've got very few options left, and they either withdraw from politics or accept corruption and move on. The second is that in order to succeed, these judges need to embrace investigative techniques that test the limits of the rule of law. And this can very quickly compromise judicial legitimacy, as we saw in some of the discussions about the judicial process, not just from partisans, but also from non-partisans who are uneasy with some of the things the prosecutors do to put these people in jail. And can, of course, this kind of judicial activism can exacerbate political polarization. And third, in contexts where corruption is systemic, the establishment is always going to fight back, right? And try to save itself. And so politicians may want to attack the prosecutors, may want to reform the courts so that they are less autonomous. And because of this polarization that is exacerbated during the process, many voters are going to want to support these politicians and their moves against the courts. But of course, the answer to these problems is not to just not investigate corruption, because that has its own problems too. So we're really in a catch-22, right? Where both prosecutorial action, but also inaction can actually pose severe dangers to both the rule of law, political stability, and democratic integrity. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we have some audience questions. Presentation, that was wonderful. I think this first question is so good, and I think it's something that happens often. So what's to keep the anti-corruption efforts from becoming corrupt? What protections are in place?
Thank you. And apologies if I went a bit over time.
No, you're good.
Oh, good. Thank you. So who's asking that question? Do we know?
It's one of our audience members from the chat.
Okay, perfect. Well, hi, how are you? Thank you for your question. So that's the $1 million question, right? And that is the big normative question. One of the things we hope to do with this project is try to think, okay, we now know how these things unfold, what enables them, what makes them controversial, what makes them problematic, what could we do, right? And in many ways, I think there isn't much one can do, because if you were to ask these prosecutors and judges to operate by the books, if you want, because this kind of corruption is so hard to prove and so hard to uncover, they would not be able to gather the evidence they need to pursue these cases, and these cases would languish, they would die. But of course, the irony is that in pursuing these cases in these unorthodox ways, they're actually violating sometimes, not always, the principles of the rule of law. And I think what we need is a stronger debate about what is acceptable and what isn't when defining these limits. So let me just draw a very quick comparison with human rights prosecutions, which is what I used to study in the past. Human rights prosecutions are also controversial, not just because they're politically controversial, they often go against powerful military figures, political figures, but also they're legally controversial, because one of the things that, for example, often happens is that courts need to declare, for example, the non-applicability of statutes of limitations to certain cases that happened in a civil war 30 years ago or in a dictatorship 30 years ago, because that's the only way that you can actually prosecute them in the present after a transition to democracy. That move was originally extremely controversial because from a very strictly formalistic legal perspective, it's problematic. But over time, social legal mobilization, human rights movements, legislators, and so on, a consensus was built that for certain kinds of crimes, you can make certain exceptions. And there's a big sort of doctrinal set of reasons derived mainly from international law for why you can do that, because there's a legitimate interest of the international community in seeing this thing punished, because states have an obligation to punish these things, number of reasons. One could imagine something similar happening with corruption prosecutions over time, right, when these things can be debated much more. I'm less hopeful about that, simply because, unlike human rights prosecutions, in corruption prosecutions, you don't have victims. I mean, you do have victims in a way, but you don't have specific victims who will be able to mobilize and try to build this legal consensus that supports legal innovation and make it less controversial.
Perfect, thank you. We have some other questions. Tiffany, one of our audience members, also asks, how is the information of systemic corruption distributed among everyday citizens in a way that can inform and change a citizen's vote or involvement?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We don't have data that shows how much they know. We have data that unfortunately I don't have here now about how much corruption they think there is. And so, for example, we, in one of the surveys in Brazil, we asked people to tell us if you think that, you know, very few politicians are corrupt, or, you know, from a scale going from that to everyone is corrupt, that sort of thing. And there's quite a lot of variation. We haven't exploited that question as much, and I think it would be a good idea to do that and see whether, you know, the extent to which what is being revealed in these processes challenges or confirms your priors sort of makes a difference in terms of how impactful these things are going to be. And you can actually expect, and it's unclear whether it's going to be more impactful among those who have whose priors suggest that corruption is marginal versus those who think it's systemic. I think there's reasons to think that they could have an impact in both sets of voters, but that's a good point.
I think this next question goes along well with that. Another one of our audience members, Anna, asks, do you believe that fear that some of the people expressed that weren't going to be any politicians left is well-founded? Do you think the system might be too rotten after all, beyond repair?
Well, I mean, that I don't know the answer to that. I mean, what the voters seem to suggest or seem to think, some of them seem to think in a very sort of dramatic way, oh, we're running out of politicians, said one participant in the focus groups. Like, well, everybody is being, cancelled, if you want, because they're being accused of corruption. So therefore, they can't participate in politics anymore because they're losing all this legitimacy. So you need, especially in a country like Peru, where it's not that you have, you know, robust political parties where you get rid of a leader and somebody else can take over. These are these parties are that Peru has are not institutionalized. So that process of leadership replacement doesn't happen. What you have is new parties popping up. So on the one hand, it is true that they could be running out of politicians, that parties could collapse in the process, and that it's difficult to replace them. But there's always something else coming up. The problem is that those who come in to replace those that are being excluded are very weak because they have no organizational infrastructure, and they often end up implicated in these forms of corruption as well, which sort of perpetuates the cycle. So in many ways, what voters actually, I think, expect more than, you know, running out of politicians is that somehow these elites will sort of endlessly sort of recycle themselves. Even if the names change, the practices won't, and the interests being represented won't.
That's interesting. I think I was just thinking about that first question that we talked about, and I think this next question ties in with it. And I personally wonder how much the public is aware or is thinking about the fact that there might be corruption in the anti-corruption systems. And this question from Barry is, what is the likelihood of corruption investigations of the previous American administration will be viewed as fair and just?
Well, let me start with the last question. So if you, I was writing the introduction to a paper the other day, and I wanted to get quotes from Donald Trump about the cases against him in the courts. And, you know, the phrase that comes up again and again is this idea of a witch hunt, right, of a hoax. And of course, Trump is not alone in using these rhetorical tactics to fend off these judicial attacks, if you want. Because of course, it's very easy, especially in highly polarized societies, I think, like in the US, to use this tactic effectively to convince your camp that there's no base in these accusations. So in many ways, the American context, I think it's sort of the perfect environment for these things to become highly polarizing and highly discredited among some sectors of society and sort of valued among other sectors of society, who will then become disappointed when nothing happens and everybody, you know, is able to go home. And sorry, can you remind me of the first question?
It was just, I mean, generally about how the people in Latin America how much are they aware of corruption that might be happening?
Yeah. So that's a big problem, because often, I mean, as I said in the talk, the room for the optimistic narrative, as we call it, is only there as long as there is the courts have some capacity to convey or project this myth of legality, which is always a myth because courts are never neutral, right? There's always some interest behind what they're doing, either, you know, of whatever that might be. But in many of these case countries, judiciaries are also themselves compromised. Sometimes the task forces that deal with these investigations are not themselves compromised, but their superiors are. So it's often the case that, for example, in Peru, this happened, the chief prosecutor at some point thought that the task force of rank and file prosecutors was going too far or going too fast, and decided to dismantle it because it thought it was going to attack his political patrons or political friends or political allies. This somehow helped the prosecutors because it generated a public opinion sort of backlash against that. But those shenanigans are always there, and they sort of discredit the institution that is supposed to be going after corruption. And because these are not Bavarian bureaucracies, right, that are governed by sort of rational bureaucratic processes, it is often easy to compromise these individual level prosecutors with bribes or that sort of thing. One of the things we argue in the book, that this is why it's so important for corruption investigations to be managed by teams, by small task forces and combat cells, because this is what allows them to build, if you want, a spirit of a corporate spirit or a sense of mission, and socialize members, new members, and so on, against these sorts of infiltrations.
All right, we have time, I think, for one more question. We have about 3 minutes left. So this last one comes from Soleil, and it asks, if interpreting the whole crusade as a mere political weapon is simplistic, how can we explain the heavy selection of only the leftists as the target of the anti-corruption crusade and not many rights?
Well, I would dispute that assessment of the kinds of targets that these crusades have chosen, if you want. In many cases, there are sort of a lot of confounders, right? So, for example, Latin America, this is a scandal, for example, around large infrastructure projects that were possible at a time of massive economic prosperity thanks to the commodity boom, right? At a time when a lot of the governments in the region also happen to be left-wing. So I think there's some of that. But I also think that if you look at the targets of the investigation in Peru, well, one could hardly think of them as left-wing. In fact, I would say all of them are, with one exception, the exception of the mayor, one of the mayors, former mayors of Lima, they're all not particularly associated with the pink tide, if you want. If you look at the figures from Brazil, you'll find that most of the convictions are actually not of politicians, but of businessmen. And the distribution of of course, Lula is an exceptional case and is the poster child, if you want, of Lava Jato in that sense, and that's why we often think it's targeted against the PT. But if you look at the proportion of, there's people from all sorts of parties being convicted and accused. And in the countries that were governed, and it's also true that in some of the cases we have in the book, the case failed miserably against left-wing figures. For example, the Lava Jato chapter in Argentina has gone nowhere, and arguably it was going after, if you want, members of the. Of course, they would still argue exactly that this is lawfare, that this is going against popular, in the Spanish Latin American sense, popular governments. But yeah. I mean, there might be some truth to it. I'm not saying there isn't, but I think it reduces this complex phenomena to this sort of Manichaean, if you want, struggle, when it's actually a bit more complicated than that, I think.
Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have. We had so many questions, so you really sparked some thoughts in our students, and we really appreciate you coming over and sharing about all the research that you're doing, and we're excited for your book to come out, so we can't wait to see that. And to our audience, thank you for your questions, and thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next forum.
Thank you very much for your questions and for coming to the talk.